COVID-19 continues to make changes to our ways of working across the life sciences industry. Our guest today, Dr. Baljit Singh, reflects on these experiences within the competitive intelligence community and discusses his recommendations on maximising insight generation in the months and years ahead. So Baljit, thank you so much for joining today's call. For those that obviously don't know, you are the managing partner and director at INOVIS, where I work also. It would be really interesting just to get a bit about your journey into competitive intelligence, like how you got into CI, as well as what you do at INOVIS, if you don't mind.
Thank you for having me here today, Harshal. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Yeah, a little bit about myself. Clearly, I'm Indian, but actually I'm a son of an immigrant that and was born in Denmark. And I did my master's in pharmacy there, and then I did a PhD in pharmaceutics in London. And after my PhD, or at the end of my PhD, I thought to myself, what exactly do I want to do going forward? And I really thought, well, let me try to get some experience more on the commercial side rather than on the research side. So I decided to apply for various jobs, and I actually, by accident, I would say more or less, ended up in a company that did competitive intelligence. I never heard about what competitive intelligence was.
Yeah.
And I started working in the company, and it was a bit of a shock, I would say, initially, to understand what it was. But then I really quickly got into it. I really enjoyed it. And I was the head of CI, I would say, in the company there, helping optimize the late life cycle strategies for pharma companies. And I then, after a few years of working there, I got an opportunity to work in Novartis in Basel. And I basically took that opportunity, moved the family down to Basel, and managed the global competitive intelligence initially for the respiratory franchise, then for primary care, and then I was director of insights. And then after a few years, I thought, it's time to probably do something a little bit different. I always had this inclination of wanting to go back, and I got a great opportunity to partner up with Mark. And basically lead the life sciences business at INOVIS. So I took that with open hands.
So it's kind of echoes my path in terms of finishing academia and wanting to do something consulting, something pharma wise, but actually doing competitive intelligence without fully being aware of what competitive intelligence was then. I suppose things have changed a little bit now as it's becoming more and more adopted in the life sciences industry. So you've worked on.
I still remember. Sorry. I still remember we met each other at a conference, right? Remember that?
Yeah.
Back in the day.
And doing consulting in life sciences, and we were both there. You were at Novartis at the time, and I was on the agency side. I think it's interesting how there seems to be two routes to competitive intelligence. There's one where you've come from the academia side and gone into kind of either agency or into a role. Most of the time it's to an agency first. And there are people that have actually worked within, I say, the industry, the client side in a different function, and then moved into competitive intelligence. What's been your experience kind of being in that yourself and now working with clients that have come from both sides?
Yeah, I always appreciate that people come from different backgrounds. They bring different perspectives into that function, and I believe that diversity is extremely important. Now, when you come from different backgrounds, you of course bring different skill sets to the table, and I would say that one of the advantages I felt that I had when I joined Novartis was that I knew what competitive intelligence was. I knew how it was obtained. I knew how to emphasize it, how to communicate it. And I knew the difficulties in obtaining that information. I also knew, the approximate budgets that needed to do certain types of work, and how much effort the vendor potentially would need to put in to actually uncover those questions. All of those elements helped me tremendously when I then moved to Novartis, because I could manage that with the stakeholders.
Yeah.
I could really ensure that I communicated the information effectively, and I took some of those consultancy capabilities into the pharma side.
Yeah.
Having said that, you also have people who come from a market research background, or people who come from a marketing background and then go into CI. And I have to say that they also bring a lot to the table, especially because they understand how companies operate, how decisions are made, how to work with cross-functional teams. And all of those elements are extremely important as well. So I would say that there is not a right or wrong answer in terms of the background, but there are different skill sets that you basically bring to the table depending on the background.
There's been traditional users and consumers of CI, and I think more recently we're noticing that there are more functions and more topics touching and using CI. I'd like to get your thoughts on how you're seeing that and the evolution that you've kind of like witnessed or observed over the last few years.
Yeah, I would actually say that it's more than now a decade since I started at Novartis. So even at that point, and even before that, I believe that decisions in pharma companies are made cross-functionally.
Yeah.
And one of the key roles for the CI professionals in those companies is really to facilitate these cross-functional teams to make a decision in terms of strategy, inform them about the competitor landscape, and help them cross-functionally to come to an alignment or agreement or decision basically around what that means for your strategy.
Yeah, and I suppose what is it ultimately that competitive intelligence does? It informs, it supports decision making. It can't always give you a black and white yes or no answer, right?
Exactly, and I think that's a really key point as well. When you come from the vendor side and you've done CI, you realize that CI is actually primary CI is actually not black and white.
Yeah.
It is many times a subjective opinion from different sources, and you utilize different sources to triangulate that information. What that means in terms of decision making is that you need to be very careful about how you interpret that, but also ensure that that there is some kind of judgment that needs to be put on top of that information. And I think that's one of the key skills as well that you need to kind of bring to the table when you are a CI professional in the pharma companies as well.
Yeah, I suppose one of the terms that we use and hear a lot is skin in the game, right? You need to be able to take a position, be aware of maybe conflicting facts, and move forward, right? Because you can't get stuck with uncertainty. There's always going to be uncertainty. It's about dealing with it, right?
Exactly, and there is always uncertainty. There is uncertainty in terms of information. There's uncertainty in terms of a decision that is being made. You might make a decision that is different from a decision that I make. It doesn't mean that your decision is wrong or mine is right. It's just a different way of approaching that same issue or problem, or even viewing that piece of information. And I think that it's an inherent kind of issue that everyone has to deal with. And it's something, and it's a skill set, actually. It's a really important skill set that you need to bring forward as well to enable you to actually have a lot of impact in your organization.
Yeah, and the term is influence without authority, or the term is used a lot, influence without authority. But I would actually go, it's one step further, because you're not just influencing, you're really trying to make a team or a group or an individual accept a position or be aware of a certain fact or area of interest or risk, right? And so actually it's about balancing all of those elements and trying to move forward, right? We don't always, moving backwards, not a good thing in
Yeah.
most cases. I think you touched, on a really good point briefly, and I suppose this is one of the main reasons we're having this discussion, is around obtaining competitive insight with the backdrop of what's happened last year with COVID and all of the restrictions and impact it's made. Maybe we'll do it on kind of like two levels. We'll talk about obtaining information when we talk about going to conferences, which is a very critical piece, and I think has had major impact on what we do and how we do it. And then go on to the primary research piece, that desk-based elicitation. So if we start on conferences, clearly a lot of conferences have not taken place in 2020 in the traditional sense, but have evolved and adapted, and CI, I expect, has adapted with it. Maybe get your thoughts, top level on what's happened with conferences last year.
Yeah. So I mean, a very important piece, I would say as well, and of course the whole Corona situation, has been an unfortunate kind of event, and it's impacted a lot of people across the world. Interestingly enough, the pharma industry have overall been somewhat insulated from financial downturns, and also in this case, the pharma industry has probably not been as impacted by the COVID pandemic as maybe other industries. The reason why I just wanted to mention this was actually the fact that back in March last year, when the pandemic really impacted and we saw all the restriction and lockdowns across the globe, we had a couple of months, or 1 or 2 months, where people were getting used to this new way of working.
Yeah.
You went from going to the office to now working at home. And during that time, there was a bit of disruption. And at the same time, you saw a lot of these conferences basically go virtual. Again, the questions that arose at that time was, what can be done during these conferences? Can you do primary CI? Can you interview people? And what we actually saw was that very quickly, people adapted to this new way of working. They realized yes, there were these virtual conferences.
Yeah.
You could attend them. You could virtually attend them. You could follow the presentations and so forth. The most challenging piece during those conferences were really the primary CI piece, the interactions you have with the attendees, the KOLs and medical experts and so forth. But we realized as well from a CI point of view that you could at times get information during the conference. You could speak to some of the attendees and so forth. But we also very quickly realized that most of the success would come by pushing some of that primary CI component to subsequent the actual conference. So there was a change, but it was not so that it was not possible at all.
Right.
And I think clients very quickly adapted to that new situation, and we worked together with the clients to find these optimal solutions to cover the conferences.
Yeah, and I suppose it's stakeholder management and just being aware of the realities of the timelines that you've got. So you have maybe data release, a big pivotal study. People want to know straight away, okay, what were they thinking? What were they saying? And you've got to be realistic. You're not going to know, an hour after that presentation, but actually it's not impossible to find out what those thoughts and feelings were. It's just adapting, I suppose, and scaling to the situation in hand. And it's, from what I hear from you, is that it still continues. Conference coverage is still continuing and is still an active part of competitive intelligence in 2020 and most likely in 2021. Is that fair to say?
I think it's a very fair point. We basically will continue to see clients need that we're going to continue to see the clients needing to have conferences covered in terms of CI, and I believe that the industry now has adapted to this kind of new reality of having virtual conferences. We might even see more conferences being virtual, and the reality is that a lot of countries are at different stages in fighting this pandemic.
Yeah.
And what that means for 2021 is really that you may see countries where virtual conferences may be still in place for the full year. Right. And in other countries, you may see some opportunities to have face-to-face meetings as well, maybe for some of the smaller conferences. So I believe that we will see the same kind of situation when it comes to conferences. But companies will now be adapting to this new reality and finding a way to get most out of these events, even if it's virtual, as we mentioned before.
Yeah. And then, switching gears, or maybe connected, I suppose, is this primary research component, which INOVIS does a lot of. So, before the pandemic hit, primary research was a big component of what INOVIS does or did. How has 2020 kind of impacted primary research when we're not talking about going to conferences?
Yeah, I mean, back to the point that I made before as well, we did see an impact, in March time last year, where people were getting used to this new way of working.
Yeah.
Not from our side as much as from the client side and the sources side. During that 1 month, there was a little bit of disruption, but then once people settled in, you were basically back to normal. Yeah. But I just want to take it back a step and look at the big picture as well, because primary CI has become more difficult over the years. It's still very much feasible, and it's something that is the bread and butter of what we do as a company. But if you look back to 1992, when we started out as a company, primary CI was a whole different animal. It was, frankly speaking, much more easy.
Yeah.
People were not so, people were more willing to share more information. But over the years, primary CI, of course, has become more difficult, especially because more and more companies are aware now in terms of what CI is.
You're right.
And that compounded with the COVID situation and changes, of course, had some impact. But actually, we very, very quickly saw things getting back to normal. And in fact, clients had more needs. They needed to understand more about the impact of COVID on clinical trials, on supply, on manufacturing, and so forth. So we really see that it posed some new additional questions, but there was no change to the needs otherwise.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a really good point yourself there around this, I suppose, disconnection with the outside world as a result of not being in an office or in a company environment. You're not surrounded by your field force. You're not surrounded by sales managers, MSLs, all the people that are engaging with the external world outside of your own company. And so, the need for understanding that competitive environment increases. Yes, we can see press releases, we get updates from our competitors and people of interest, but there are always going to be gaps in between. And I suppose what I'm hearing from you is that primary research will always potentially have a place to help address and maybe fill in some of those gaps. Is that fair?
I think it's a very fair point. And actually, in my thoughts are the following, that this pandemic was basically also an assertion of the fact that competitive intelligence, and especially primary CI, is something that is needed regardless of whether or not you had a pandemic or not. And it means that we are almost, insulated from the fact that regardless of whether or not there are financial downturns or upturns and so forth, or whether or not there is some pandemic, the companies are still doing business. They still need to understand the external environment. They still need to define their strategies. And therefore, the need for somebody like us and our agency to help them understand that external environment is still essential for driving strategies forward.
That's really well put. Just as we're closing up, put you on the spot here and ask you if someone is considering to make a career move and enter competitive intelligence, with your experience on wearing these multiple hats in the company and in the agency, what advice would you give someone considering to make that move into competitive intelligence?
Of course, it's different to be in competitive intelligence in the pharma companies, and it's different to be on the vendor side. Because on one side, you are a service provider and you provide a service to the clients. But I would say one thing: if you want to be successful within CI, it's not only about the hard skills as well. It's also about the soft skills. It's about understanding, in which environment you are working. And I believe that, especially in the pharma companies, you need to make sure that you create some personal equity. You need to make sure that you are transparent, you are honest, you are able to manage your stakeholders. You have to be able to influence without authority. There are a lot of soft skills that are imperative in order to actually succeed. And you have to be ready to learn new things. You need to be able to absorb and get up to speed in new areas, because CI as a capability goes across. It goes clinical, regulatory, commercial, but also manufacturing and many other areas. So you need to get up to speed quickly in these areas to understand it enough to be able to have an informed discussion with your stakeholders. And you have to realize how things operate in the companies. You need to be able to understand, how do you influence stakeholders and how do you enable them to make a decision. So that's some of the key skill sets that I believe are important. But I have to say that it's hugely satisfying once you are involved there. It's a rush. You are involved. It's busy. And if you like that kind of environment where there is changes all the time, then of course it's a hugely interesting area.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Baljit, for your time and insights today. It's been a pleasure listening to your thoughts and opinions on this, and we'll obviously see how 2021 unfolds. Thank you for joining us on another Competitive Insight series video, where we hope to provide you an opportunity to hear from a range of industry thought leaders and partners on topics related to competitive strategy. As ever, you can reach out to us directly through our website at inovis.global, where you'll find more resources, tools and case studies on competitive intelligence and strategic consulting.